Hello, everyone. My name is Ari Stein, and I am the lead curator for cogX and stage manager for this beautiful room. A huge welcome to our virtual audience and a huge welcome to our on-site audience. It's been an incredible couple of days, and it's a huge pleasure to introduce this first session of the last day of cogX Hybrid Festival 2021. This session is in conjunction with CyLon. They've been a wonderful partner, and they've helped put together some enormously exciting sessions, and this one is another one of those. I have some housekeeping. I just like to remind people a couple of things. First of all, please try and download the cogX app, which is out. There's a barcode on your seats, and in the virtual world you can do the same. It's on the App Store, so feel free to kind of browse through that. I really would encourage anyone out there to ask as many questions as you can. For this session in particular, you can drive it through the virtual platform, and if you're in this room, which you are, I can see, don't be afraid to put up your hand and ask a question to our moderator, Jonathan. I'd like to give a huge thanks to BT, Quantum Black, Accenture, and Visa for making this festival happen. They've been wonderful headline sponsors. There's a couple of things to note if you're out and about today. There's a virtual networking room on site, and there's a virtual booth for businesses, so you can exchange contacts and get to know people. There's an extraordinary amount of activity happening throughout cogX, so make sure you take advantage of it. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Jonathan Luff, who is from CyLon, who's going to be chairing today's session, Leadership in Cyber and Security. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Ari. Hello, welcome to cogX. As Ari said, my name's Jonathan Luff. I'm the co-founder of CyLon, where our mission is to find and develop the security technologies of the future. And we do that with some amazing entrepreneurs, investors, and innovators. We're delighted to partner with cogX to bring you this session in the cyber and defense track. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to explore the vital issue of leadership in the field of cybersecurity. It would be hard, I think, to find two people better suited to discuss this issue than my guests this morning. So let me introduce them to you. First, on my right, I'm joined by Lindy Cameron. Lindy is the director of the National Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC, and she has held senior leadership positions across the UK civil service in her career. She now has the onerous responsibility of defending UK citizens, businesses, infrastructure, and organisations against cyber attacks, and she has a unique perspective, therefore, on the challenges we face. I'm going to ask her about her own philosophy of leadership and about some of the wider issues in cybersecurity. Second, to Lindy's right, Rashmy Chatterjee, welcome. Rashmy is the Chief Executive Officer of ISTARI, a cybersecurity platform headquartered here in London, but with a global network established by Temasek, the Singaporean investment company. Before joining ISTARI, Rashmy was the Chief Marketing Officer for IBM in North America and Global Sales Lead for IBM's security business. She was also the first female engineer in the Indian Navy and rose to become the Deputy Director of Naval Design. So a fascinating array of leadership and other organizational experience. And I'm really looking forward to her perspective. So good morning to you both. Good morning also to our audience here in the auditorium and everybody watching via the platform cogX app and Hopin. The first thing to say is that we're delighted to be here in person, which is a first for me in the past year. I think it is for you too as well. Bear with us, please, while we get used to refamiliarizing ourselves with this kind of format. The format for today will be a conversation. I'm hoping there will be some opportunities for the audience watching online, as well as our audience here, to ask some questions. Please send those in. I'll be able to see those on the iPad and hopefully include them in the discussion. Happily, I have the privilege of asking the first question. So, Lindy, if I may, I'd like to ask you a little about your role at the NCSC. It's a huge responsibility. You spoke this week in your RUSI lecture about taking a whole nation approach to cybersecurity. So it's a big thing. Could you tell us a little about how you set about such a mammoth task and how you're going to judge progress?
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And it's fantastic to be here. And as you say, really fantastic to be here in person as an extrovert. I'm just delighted to have people around me again. So I was really lucky to take over an incredibly effective organization from my predecessor, Kieran Martin, who Rashmy knew well, who left me a superb legacy of an organization set up 5 years ago to try and make the UK the safest place to live and work online. But I've also been lucky enough to inherit a strategy, which I think the UK government really led globally on and also funded very effectively 5 years ago to try and help with that mission. So NCSC was set up to try and pull together a central point in the UK government for leading on cybersecurity, essentially so that in a critical incident, everybody knew who to turn to. And that really is one of our key roles. It's leading the sort of 24/7 incident management response to critical national incidents, things that pass a particular threshold, but also then to understand the wider breadth of threats that face the UK. And as you say, not just the UK government, but the UK's critical national infrastructure, the private sector, very widely defined, so everything from hairdressers and farmers all the way up to nuclear power plants, but also citizens. So, I have the fantastic job of leading an organization that does everything from providing guidance to, how to change your passwords, using three random words, to really thinking about the most sophisticated kind of actors that the UK faces in cyberspace. And so I took on a really well set up organization, but one that was very much still a startup, I think. So part of my job as I see it is taking the NCSC into its mature phase. So taking us into the next generation strategy, taking us into a point where we've got a stable funding base, but also we know what the enduring roles and responsibilities of the NCSC will be. And I think, again, I feel very fortunate in timing, because this year the UK government will refresh its strategy for cyber, coming out of the integrated review, which I think if you look has the headlines for that in it. But we're working now across government to work out what that next generation will look like. And as I say, the challenge for us is both to build on the successes of the past. And I think we've done an awful lot, not just in incident management, but also actually in building the resilience of the economy. And I'm really proud of the fact that the UK has resilience absolutely at the core of its strategy. I think it's very easy to get distracted onto the sort of, chasing the threat of today. Actually, the challenge for us is building resilience against the threat of tomorrow. So we are very focused on building that resilience, but we're also focused on building the ecosystem of skills and expertise in a diverse way for a diverse future society. I mean, we're part of GCHQ, so we're part of a national organization. It's really important that we reflect the society we live in. But it's also important that we get the benefit of that massively diverse talent base in the UK. And I'd like to see, for example, more women in the organization. I'd like to see a more diverse organization that represents society more effectively. So for me, it's about stabilizing the organization, ensuring we've got a mature next generation. It's about building that capability in a diverse way that reflects the talent we have. And it's about making sure the UK remains at the cutting edge of cybersecurity, continues to be the safest place to live and work online. And to do that, we need to stay ahead of the kind of threats we can see now. And those, of course, are changing. I talked a little bit about this in my RUSI lecture this week. Obviously, we see a combination of nation-state actors, but in particular, we've seen a threefold increase in ransomware in the last year. And I described in that lecture the way that ransomware paralyzes organizations that aren't prepared and really has them on the back foot if they haven't. So what we're really keen to do is to help people prepare better, but also then take advantage of the interest there's been. I mean, I hadn't expected to see quite the scale of ambition and interest I saw in the last week from G7 leaders at NATO, partly driven by some of the recent attacks in the US that has meant that the US, I think, has really, under the Biden administration, seen cybersecurity as a core part of its national security. And that, I think, is helping us to put together a global coalition of people who are interested in seeing this as something that is about the prosperity and potential success of the whole world, not just of any individual nation state. So it's a really exciting time to be a leader in cybersecurity. As I say, I inherited a fantastic setup from Kieran, and I pay huge tribute to him. But I think, we've got a really exciting few years ahead of us, and I'm, looking forward to the journey.
Thank you, Lindy. I'll come back to a couple of those points you raised in a minute, if I may. But you mentioned your sense that NCSC feels a little like a startup, and I'd actually like to ask Rashmy about that, because Rashmy, you were given the mandate to build ISTARI from scratch, so effectively a startup of your own. Could you give us a sense of the priorities that you have had as you've set up that organization, and how you think about leadership?
Yeah, first of all, Lindy, such a powerful mandate in such exciting times. Really seems to be center of all the world's discussions. So it's a great time to be there. So ISTARI was set up, Temasek established ISTARI, and it really was to address a problem that we felt was very important in the world and that nobody was looking at. So the problem is, number one, obviously, digitalization is increasing the digital footprints, and that enables and empowers attackers. You're going to have more crime in New York City than in Antarctica. Density counts. Add to that a layer of geopolitics, where there are tensions, and when you're connected digitally, interconnected supply chains, global companies, global R&D, and countries have different values and different perspectives, that adds a different layer to the whole digital threat landscape, because you have attackers, but now many of them are getting more sophisticated. They get better funded. They often have a purpose and a reason for what they're doing. On top of that, you add the way the market has developed over the last few years. Very fragmented market. Over the last 2 decades, the cybersecurity market has developed a tool at a time. One problem, a solution, another problem, a solution. So while there are lots of tools, there's really not enough focus on making sure that you're understanding the threat in your landscape, understanding your risk, prioritizing on your risk, making sure that you're all aligned to address that risk. And the downside of doing that is terrible, because as a company, you can face reputational risk, you face financial and operational risk, obviously as a business, but more so as we are seeing every day at a human level and at a social level, there's a lot of risk that's building up. So when we started discussing the idea of ISTARI, we were very clear on a couple of things. One is that it's a business imperative. It's a leadership imperative. It's not just about the technology. It's very important to have the right technology, but the right technology alone is not going to make us secure. It's going to be surrounded by the right policy, by the right people, etc. And the second is that it's a journey. So any idea that is often quite stridently communicated in the market that a tool solves a problem is not true. It's a journey. It's like health. At times you'll need medicines, at times you need exercise, sometimes you need diet. Over the journey to becoming more resilient, you'll need different products, different services. Sometimes you need to cut costs, sometimes you need to optimize. And that's the journey that ISTARI. ISTARI actually means the navigators in Lord of the Rings. So that's the journey that ISTARI was set up to navigate with clients. With that ambition that we will partner with clients, stay with them long term to get them more resilient and help them sort of pivot this dialogue from a very busy market. It's a $200 billion market where I believe the highest market share is 2.5%. So it's really fragmented. So pivot the dialogue from a market and tools to let's understand the customer, let's understand where you are, what's most important to you, which country do you operate, which industry, is it regulated, not regulated, etc., and solve their resiliency from that angle. And what we prioritized, actually, I asked many times, as you can imagine, before I took this on, what would account for success? And the answer was always clear: find the right talent, people who understand the space and people who understand what requires to be done. So we really focused on talent and people. I'm very proud of the team we were able to build up. We're 18 months now since inception and in market for about 8-9 months. So focused on people. We focused on portfolio. We also have a fairly good fund. We have a couple of $1 billion to invest in our portfolio. So we focused on building absolutely a top quality portfolio that's curated. And, most of these companies, we are part investors. They're independent, very agile, very contemporary companies. And then most of all, we focused on the culture of allowing the team to really be with the client and keeping an open mind on understanding what needs to be done. We are not transactional, not publicly listed, not planning to get publicly listed. The idea is to have a team of ISTARI navigators, work with clients, get them more resilient, and strengthen their ability to do that with a portfolio of companies.
Rashmy, thank you. I'm struck by some of the parallels between what you've just described at ISTARI and the challenge that you face, Lindy. Could we just go back to a couple of things that you both talked about, resilience, and you both talked about preparedness. From NCSC's perspective, how are you sort of measuring success? Because these are quite difficult things to quantify. But how do you think about resilience and preparedness yourself?
So it's a really good question. And we've done a lot of work in this in the last few years, I think, particularly with critical national infrastructure, working with regulators to think about how it is they can help organizations to self-assess their own readiness, and actually also think about how, again, as regulators, they can look at that. So we use something called the Cyber Assessment Framework, which helps organizations to understand the kinds of threats they might face. It's tested against the kind of threats we see, and it helps us to help them think through in a fairly nuanced way the kind of resilience they need to have against future cyber threats. And it's a model that allows us to think about different levels of maturity for different levels of organizations that face different kinds of threats. And I think that's quite important. It's hard to sort of give a very simplistic set of measures. I mean, one of the big challenges for us, obviously, bluntly, is more attacks, good or bad, in a sense. And that the question is, are you seeing the full picture? You want to understand it as well as possible. That may mean you see more, but of course, what you're trying ultimately to do is drive down the level of harm to the UK. And I think that's something we're still working on, really understanding how to measure effectively. I mean, for example, we've had extraordinary success with active cyber defense over the last year. I mean, 700,000 scams, 80,000 of which were reported for the first time by the British public. So some of the things we use, the suspicious email reporting service, for example, we've seen huge interest in people helping us to help themselves by reporting both spam emails and text messages. So we can see a lot of activity. The question is it just that we're understanding the scale of it, or are we actually succeeding in driving down the harm? And I think that's one of the key challenges for us. In terms of our own resilience, I think all organizations have been hugely tested in the last year and a half. And so I'm proud to say that we've come through pretty robustly. So I think, frankly, we'd set ourselves up with the kind of technology that allowed us to work, in a very dispersed and hybrid way. And that's given us the kind of resilience. And, some of the things my developers have done are extraordinary, to be able to work in a dispersed way on threats that range from high-end national security threats all the way through to, to the very public and open. So I think we've tested it. I have to say, I think people are tired. There is a real sense of weariness. As I say, as an extrovert, I'm delighted to see people. It gives me huge energy. Other people are quite fearful of what it will be like to come back to a different world. And so I think there is a huge leadership challenge to try and recognize that diversity of different personal experience in a complex organization and make sure you carry everybody through that in their own way, supporting them in the way that they need to be.
Thanks, Lindy. If I can come back to you, Rashmy, again, I know you've written about this question of resilience in organizations. I think you described it as, forgive me for paraphrasing, but sort of bounce back ability. How quickly can you recover when you have had a serious incident? How do you, what qualities, leadership and other, do you think an organization needs in order to become more resilient?
Yeah, great question. Obviously, very close to my heart. So I think, cybersecurity used to be seen as a more technical field. So often understanding of being resilient was delegated to only technology, but technology is one aspect of it. So I sincerely believe that a leader any strong leader in today's world has to leave their company more digitally resilient than what they took it on. That is responsible leadership, right? And it's also collective leadership, because you're only as safe as the next person is safe. So not only your own area, you have to work very closely as Lindy's discussing, to get the entire environment more secure. And we talk about something called cores, which is the first thing about resiliency is there a culture of cyber awareness? The example I give is, I grew up in India. I have it in my DNA to sense risk. If you're living in a digital world, do you have that does everybody in your ecosystem, not just your employees, your consultants, contractors, do they have the DNA of risk? That's cultural. Then organization, when you will be attacked, everyone's going to be attacked without a doubt. It's all about how well you recover, right? So organization is important because it's a speed of response that defines your success. And, you know, the military has normally been very good because they have very clear hierarchy. So in an organization, understanding who is responsible for what, there will be technical things, there'll be communication, government regulation, there'll be many things to kick in once there's been a successful attack. So organizationally, you shouldn't lose time. I think risk is a very important part because you will never be fully secure. So you need to understand what you're covering for, what you're not covering for. Just be clear on that. And then ecosystem, as I said, collective leadership is hugely important. No, as we saw with COVID, nobody exists in a bubble. This is a digitally connected global world. You're only as secure as your peers or your community or country. And then the last thing is, I think the leader has to be strategic. They have to look at cybersecurity as an advantage, not as a cost. You know, if you have a street where every house gets robbed and one doesn't, that person is unlikely to come out waving their hand and say, I didn't get robbed. They'll be quiet. But there is a reason why they didn't get robbed. You know, maybe they had better lights, maybe they had whatever, I don't know. So understanding that cybersecurity is going to be a strategic asset for their business is important. And at ISTARI, we do a lot of it with our thought leadership. We do, you know, we're working with Columbia University to run programs for senior leaders to really, to start really operationalizing culture, organization, risk, ecosystem, and strategy. And care very passionately about standards. I think there's a lot of money being spent on cybersecurity. Is it all effective? You know, standards and efficacy help that. We actually, one of our colleagues has published something with Kieran Martin and Garrison. So responsible leadership, collective, and strategic thinking about cybersecurity.
That's really interesting, and you know, might ask you to come back on that, Lindy, because I know Rashmy has focused a lot of her commentary, both today and in her writing, on the CEO's duty. To get this right, and actually we've got a question along those lines from the online audience, which I might use to set this up. Ian Sheridan asks how corporate boards can do more when many of their leaders don't have a STEM background, and I'm sure you'll both have some thoughts on this. But how does the CEO, when they don't have all of the expertise, engineering expertise, how do you lead in those circumstances?
So I think Rashmi's covered some of this already. I mean, the point is, this is not a technically expert issue. This is about great leadership. I have to say, you know, somebody asked me the other day, you know, whether I was worried about, you know, young people in an organization. I said, I'm not worried about them at all. What I am worried about is the senior people who do I'm not part of the internet age, you know, really, that's like no excuse, to be honest, right now. So, you know, this is as important as financial risk is. You wouldn't expect a CEO to ever say, oh, well, I'm not an accountant, so I don't understand the accounts. In the same way, I would never expect them to say, oh, well, I just asked my CIO for the answer. You know, I'm not a cybersecurity expert. Yeah, this is an operational risk. This is a financial risk. This is a reputational risk. This isn't about how the attack happens. This is about what happens to your business in the, as you say, the hours and days afterwards, when actually the question is, how fast can you recover? How do you reassure your shareholders? How do you make sure that you've got those offline backups that mean that you can restore systems, even if actually you're going to have a long, slow process of doing that? So it's very much about having done the planning. You know, we have an exercise in the box tool that helps people understand the kind of scenarios they might face. And we suggest to boards that they work through that to make sure they've anticipated what this will feel like, frankly, to make sure they know who the people in the organization are who have that expertise, and that they get them into the boardroom to have that conversation early. Because if you don't understand that, you can't, as Rashmy says, set the culture that has an expectation of you want people, you want the network defenders, you want the people who are sort of the admins of the network to be thinking, this is something that has the priority all the way down from the CEO. This is something I understand is fundamentally important to the organization. And I think that's the tone of leadership people need to set. So I think there is an awful lot that leaders can do. It is, you know, you don't, I mean, I didn't come to this with a deep STEM expertise or a cybersecurity background. I came with a much broader national security background. It's been a fantastically interesting, you know, learning curve to be on, I have to say. But I think that any reasonable CEO can get themselves to the point where they understand the questions they should be asking, the kind of issues they should care about. As I say, you know, this is a matter that, you know, G7 global leaders are talking about now. This is not a technically specialist subject.
Yeah, and is that something that the academy that you're establishing, Rashmy, intends to address? Is it that particular question of how you engender this culture among leaders?
Yeah, very much. So how do you, again, very much agree, Lindy, with you on that leaders have been able to understand very complicated financial risk, very complicated legal risk. So this is not complicated relatively. So culture, the academy focuses on how do you build a culture of cyber awareness, cyber smart. Organization is really important, and we talk about testing the organization for 3 speeds. The first speed is just business as normal. Are you secured? You have identity access, all the stuff we talk about. The second speed is how well are you capturing disruption? Events are happening around the world that could increase the level of risk, reduce it. Do you have a system in your organization to capture that? So do you have conversations where in your staff meeting, somebody comes and says, by the way, we are seeing this new noise coming up here, but we've got it under control. And then, of course, the third speed is how do you address it when there's an attack, a successful attack? So organizationally testing, and we help clients test it for all 3 speeds. Risk, the basic thing is the CEO owns the risk appetite. The CEO just needs, or the leader, the board, it's also, you can't, I think CEOs often ask, just tell me, am I spending enough and am I spending on the right things? But that is delegating that ownership of appetite to somebody else.
Yeah.
You've got to know that it's not technical. You got to know, look, I know we're reasonably covered about ABC. We are doing very rapid move to the cloud in the next 1 year. That exposes some new risk. We're not fully covered there. That's a business dialogue, right? And we saw this in digital transformation, which started with technology, but then became very much a business conversation. And then I think the leader very much, I keep going back to my course, but leader very much owns the E, which is exist in the ecosystem to make a change, to make your industry more resilient.
Thanks. We're getting questions coming in online. I do want to remind the audience that if they do have a question, then please just raise your hand and I'll come to you and try and include it in the discussion. Just coming back on this question of chains of command and how you respond in a crisis, because I'm struck by the tension between the sort of flatter organizations that we've moved towards and have perhaps accelerated further in the last year as everybody has been working in a more distributed way, and the clear chain of command and hierarchy that is perhaps essential under conditions of crisis. How do we get that balance right, Lindy? Are we able to reconcile those 2 competing pressures?
Absolutely. So I think for me, it's about knowing which mode you're in. So I can almost sort of feel an organization switching when it goes into full-on crisis mode, where you are trying really hard to make sure that you're distilling a huge amount of complex information into the key issues that will allow decision makers, in my case, often politicians, to make really critical decisions in an incredibly time-sensitive way. And you're trying to make sure that you are both escalating and also understanding and having that full sort of the aperture fully open to understand everything that's going on and taking it in. And that can only be done, I think, through frankly, practicing, exercising that, understanding what it feels like. I would say we're lucky that because there's a fairly regular tempo of cyber incidents, in a sense, what we're doing every day is triaging the kind of incidents that we're seeing, understanding what's happening, and constantly sort of juggling which ones look like they might be becoming more serious, which ones actually we think are reasonably under control, which ones have a lesson that we need to take away. So, for example, we've seen spates of ransomware in the education sector recently. On that, it's actually critical to make sure we're getting the lessons out really rapidly to the wider sector to make sure that they can understand how to prepare themselves for that. So I feel like the muscles flex in a different way when you go into crisis, and it does become, as you say, more important that everybody, and you'll know this from your military experience, everybody knows what their roles are at that point. You're not sort of making it up as you go along. But actually, it's also important to be able to flex back quite rapidly, because organizations burn out if they stay in crisis mode for too long. And they need to be able to relax back into the honest lesson learning, sort of the real debrief that helps you understand what you could have done better, but also why this happened. Really driving down this root cause analysis of understanding what could have done, what you could have done differently, what others could have done differently, to make sure that feedback loop works, so that we can then, as I say, work with sectors, work with regulators, work with the wider sort of economy and society to understand how do you make sure you're better prepared for the kinds of evolving technology that we're seeing. So, I mean, I have to say, I rather shamefully sort of enjoy crises. It's a particular kind of adrenaline that you get from sort of being forced to really explain things and really take decisions under pressure. But you can probably tell that from some of the things I've done in my career. So actually, the challenge for me is really understanding the other response, that the sort of more open, innovative, challenging, open dialogue where you need to be in a very different mode.
Well, I was going to ask about that because you made reference to it. You're before leading NCSC, you were at the Department for International Development, overseeing aid, and you've had deployments in some really interesting places. DFID had a deserved reputation for innovating in terms of its organization and its leadership. What have you brought from that experience into your role at NCSC?
So I think one of the most important things actually is the kind of risk management that Rashmy's talking about. So I ran a portfolio of £4 billion portfolio every year of programs and projects in 32 offices globally, in some of the most difficult countries in the world, Somalia, Afghanistan, places, DRC, for example, as well, places where we were facing a hugely complex set of political, operational, financial, delivery risks. And actually the only way that I could do that was to create that culture of great risk management, because I had leaders who were thousands of miles away from their immediate boss, both responsible for the safety and security of their own people in some very high-risk environments, but also responsible for the UK government's money and making sure we were getting fantastic value for money and making sure that we were having real effect for poor people. So actually creating that culture of great risk management is what allows you to know that, frankly, the right person will be on the phone saying, I wouldn't normally call you, but this is something I think you need to know about, escalating effectively, but also able to know that I would have their back if they were taking really tough decisions on a day-to-day basis. And so I think it's about creating that capability, those systems to make sure that you can do that. And frankly, it's also about picking great people. So I was extraordinarily privileged to work with some absolutely amazing people who should be very proud of what they do for the country.
As no doubt you do now in your
I do indeed,
role.
exactly.
And now I'm quite excited. We've had a couple of questions submitted from our online audience. We also have a question from the audience here in the auditorium. So Tim from the NCC group was asking about the Computer Misuse Act here in the UK and how it sometimes hampers the efforts of companies like his to tackle some of the threats we face. Lindy, the question was to you. Any indication that is being addressed, and what's your view?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, as you'll probably know, the Home Secretary has announced that there will be a review of the Computer Misuse Act. We were lucky enough to have her speaking live at our own Cyber UK conference. So we are committed to that. I mean, frankly, like you, we believe that legislation was designed in a different era. And I think, as I mentioned in my speech on Monday at RUSI, no current generation of technologists has correctly anticipated quite the scale of future change that future generations have experienced. And in this case, indeed, I think this was an act designed for a different era. It needs to be updated and changed for the current era we see ourselves in, but it also needs to be robust and resilient for the future. So one of the things we've tried to do in the support we've given, for example, on the telecoms bill, is to make sure that we're setting up the legislation so that it not only tackles the challenges of today, it's also robust and resilient enough to go as far as we can see into the future in anticipating the kind of threats and issues that we'll face tomorrow.
Lindy, thanks. I've got a question from James Jassy online, which I might ask to you first, Rashmy. James asks about the importance of storytelling rather than scare tactics. And his question is, how do we use storytelling more effectively to change cyber culture in organizations? What can we do about improving that skill set?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, this is here to stay. We are not going back in the digital world. So this managing resilience, being resilient is going to stay. And I do think that the storytelling in the past has been driven, as I said, by a fragmented market. So it's focused on, if you don't have this, oh my God, there's a problem. We have to change that to much more business language and much more continuum, and actually be obsessive about language, because it isn't about scaring, it's about managing. It's about anticipating, being prepared, managing. So I think storytelling in cyber security is really critical especially as you want to get your leadership and your boards understanding. There's an equal responsibility for the community to sort of reduce the level of technology we have in the conversation and add more business language.
Lindy, do you have a
Yeah, can I
comment?
just add on that? I mean, I think Rashmy's absolutely right. Storytelling is vital. Some of the most powerful things I've heard in the last in the 8 months I've been in this job have been CEOs describing what it has felt like to be sort of in that first 24 hours. And I think the reason it's powerful is because it appeals to people's emotions. And frankly, that's what cyber criminals do really well. They put you in a position where you feel as if you have no choice. You feel as if, the only way out of this is to do what they're asking you to do. And actually, if you've thought through what that emotion will feel like in advance, you've understood how somebody else felt, I think it prepares you to know what you could do and how you should prepare your organization for it. So I think it is incredibly important, but it's really important we don't have a culture of blame. I think one of the things we're most proud of is that we want a culture of learning. We don't have a culture of blame. So it's not people's fault if they click on a dodgy link. Actually, it means that we didn't help them well enough to work out what not to do. Their organization didn't make it difficult for them. It wasn't automatically challenged. So I think that it's important that people feel like, frankly, there's a sort of just culture. People are able to admit when things go wrong so that you can learn from them and do it better next time, rather than feeling as if you should hide and protect. So one of the things I worry about, for example, is actually that organizations become wary of reporting. And actually, reporting is so important because it's only through that we learn and understand how to protect others.
I'm conscious that there's so much interesting stuff to talk about here, and we could go on for the whole day. We only have a limited amount of time. I want to get through as many questions as I can before we run out of time. So I've got a few rapid fire questions to see how many we can get in the time available. So I'll ask each of you. Actually, I'll ask you in turn. Whether there's someone or an act of leadership that you particularly admire. And why that is. Lindy, can I come to you first?
So the leader I most admire is somebody called Sergio Vieira de Mello, who died in the Canal Hotel bombings in Baghdad in 2003, who was an incredible UN leader, able to lead through crises in places like East Timor. And there is a fantastic biography of him written by an amazing woman called Samantha Power, who currently runs US8. So there is, I think there's something about leadership in crisis, but also the ability to be a charismatic human being and somebody who's self-aware about their own strengths and weaknesses, not perfect, but able to take a team with them. And the reason I say this is because I met so many people who worked with him who still held very dear to what it was he would have wanted them to do. Yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned Sergio and reminded our audience of his leadership. I was in Baghdad at the time, and I remember it was a great tragedy actually. But a hugely influential figure. Rashmy, could I ask you the same question?
Yeah, I think for me, any leader who is inclusive and brave, can face the realities and address. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore. He had to lead at a time of a lot of disruption. And I think their focus on human dignity and human equality, fairness, making very difficult decisions which were required. Singapore is a very small country. I think the more I read about him, it epitomizes courage of decision making.
Thanks, Rashmy. I've got a couple more questions before we run out of time. So the first one for you both, if there's a book, a blog, an article, something you've seen even over the past year, which you would really recommend to our audience, doesn't have to be about cyber or about leadership, but perhaps on those issues, if you can. Lindy, I'll come to you first.
Thanks. So my director of operations recommended one to me, which I have to say I thought was just a fantastic read, which is the sort of cybersecurity classic, Cuckoos Egg by Cliff Stoll, which I think just for me really sort of stripped back the complexity of the modern age right back to cybersecurity at the sort of the dawn of the internet era, basically, and helped me really understand sort of that complexity. And actually, to some extent, the way the internet had grown and the layers we put on top of it. So I couldn't recommend it more. It's actually just a fantastic read.
Fantastic, thank you. And Rashmy, same question to you.
There's a very good blog. It's an MIT Sloan paper called Making Cybersecurity a Strategic Asset. I really enjoyed that. I think it positioned cybersecurity in a very interesting way. And actually, a book that I've been very impressed with, which I've read recently, which has nothing to do with cyber, is called The Courage to be Disliked. Which I found quite interesting.
I know you've talked about this, the importance of being able to manage conflict in positions of leadership. So I know this is something that that you think is vital. Last question to you both before we finish. It's been a turbulent year, I think it's fair to say, in all sorts of ways. As you were saying, Lindy, huge increase in the amount of ransomware attacks that we're seeing in particular. But are you more hopeful or more pessimistic about our cyber preparedness than you were a year ago, and why?
So I am more optimistic, but that's partly because I know more than I did. I think, a year ago I came very new to this, and I have been so impressed by what I've seen here in the UK in particular, by the culture we've created. I mean, as I said, NCSC is quite an extraordinary organisation, particularly for one in government. I've not seen that level of agility and the ability to create something so new and so effective in such a short space of time. So that leaves me, as you said, I have fantastic colleagues, an amazing bunch of experts who work for me. So I am incredibly optimistic, but also because I think there's now much more of a global consensus that this is an issue that matters. It's a leader level issue. It's no longer a technical issue. And I think that will give us the ability to put cybersecurity in context.
Thanks. And same question to you, Rashmy. How do you feel about this?
No, same answer. I'm optimistic.
Great.
I think it's come surfaced top of the table of the agenda. It's, policy, governments, private sector, everyone's working together to look at it and to address it. So it's not tucked away in somewhere in an organization. So I'm very optimistic.
Thank you to you both. Well, I think we can agree it really is a leadership question. If it wasn't before, it very much is now. I want to thank you both for your time this morning and for answering all of my questions and those from the audience so fully. Can I thank our audience here and watching online? I'd like to thank cogX, who've been fantastic partners for us at CyLon, and thank you all for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.